Look, I started out here. I'm a Perth boy. Was very fortunate to go to Curtin University and study journalism back in the mid-90s at really what is one of Australia's greatest journalism schools. Such a fantastic university. And through that, I sort of graduated into the declining media market of the year 2000. You know, the early 2000s, the dot-com boom had happened and media was just on terminal decline. So I did what every Aussie does, and jumped on a plane and went up to London. And when I was up there, just things fell into place, and I met this amazing group of entrepreneurs up there who were starting up a dot-com company, and they were basically looking at business-to-business publishing. So, you know, not the retail media that was in decline, but this world of B2B publishing, which was booming. And somehow ended up with an arrangement at the end of it where I got to, my friend Drew here will attest, I used to, in the way before outsourcing was a word, I would sit on the hill at Yallingup in my parents' beach shack and do work for London while pounds were coming down the telephone line via a dial-up modem, and just couldn't believe my luck sitting there in front of one of Australia's best waves, working for these guys in London. You know, it was incredible. But one of the publications they had was this money laundering magazine. And this is way before Australia had an AML-CTF Act, which, for those that don't know, is anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing. But after September 11, there was this huge focus on dirty money and its relationship with the financing of terrorism. So the anti-money laundering regime just took off. And it was before Australians were even aware of this. London was way ahead of the curve. So after doing that for a while, Mark, I sort of started to meet all these amazing characters, the crooks, the money launderers, the
crooks.
cops. There's a few of them in London. You know, just this hidden world of money that we don't get to see. And also the undercover people that have gone inside drug cartels and laundered money for them, you know, and taken the risk of an instant, basically, you know, their life is on the line in that work. So, and met whistleblowers as well who'd been within banks that were laundering money for drug cartels and spoke up because that was their job, and then got absolutely destroyed. So just met all of these amazing characters, and it's been a 20-year journey.
So how did you end up at Thomson Reuters? I mean, you're at Asia Pacific region. So you run a award-winning intelligence team. And so how did it end up managing a team like that across the globe, from sitting at Yallingup with a book?
Yeah, I had to leave Yallingup, unfortunately, and get serious. So I'd been telling the guys in London, we've got to start this in Australia. And then with the passage of the anti-money laundering laws in 2006, that was the opportunity. So 3 of us moved to Sydney and set up Australia New Zealand for this business complement. And it was basically, so people wouldn't really understand this world, but there's a whole world out there of screening customers against privately managed watch lists. So there's big lists with tens of thousands of entities on the list that have been engaged in corruption, drug dealing, crime, suspected things, politically exposed people, their associates. So these databases are maintained. So we had one of those databases. We had software for screening transactions. So you could pick up suspicious transactions and report them. And we had the information around that, what to look for. So that was a pretty successful business, and that got bought by Thomson Reuters in 2010.
Okay.
And then they then bolted it together with some other businesses and built a $20 billion risk management business. Which
Wow.
they've now flogged off.
So we're obviously going to, and Elizabeth's going to ask a few questions. How, look, just a
Gotta
little
keep
bit of
some
wind back.
structure.
The elephant, what we're going to, no, this is fascinating, and we're going to talk about a little bit about this. And we'll have a chat about how you get your hands on a book. Signed. Sponsored by PrivateInvest. Sorry, Naomi. So he only bought 50, so 80 in the room would be right. Okay, so...
I suppose I'm interested, Nathan, in finding out about the researching of the book, just a bit of the journey about writing the book.
You know, in my work with Thomson Reuters, I'm travelling all across Asia, the Middle East, and going to really interesting places, meeting these fascinating people. And, you know, at the same time, I do capacity building, so I work with organisations like the Asian Development Bank, the US Department of Justice, some volunteer groups, and we go to developing countries and train them up in detecting, deterring, disrupting financial crime. It's such interesting work and it's so rewarding, and you meet all these fascinating people and then they're telling you incredible stories always. And so the kid that did journalism back in the mid-90s is just like a moth to these lights of stories that people are telling you, you know. So, you know, I've met people who have, in Pakistan, for instance, working in banks, and they're reporting terrorism-related transactions and reporting it to the Financial Intelligence Unit, which then has to share that with police and go and make arrests. And they're being trailed home by cars, you know. Their lives are in danger. The bank ends up having to give them 24/7 armed guards. So this is what's going on in some of these countries. We've had people that have written for us get detained for years in jails in Iran and, you know, parts of Southeast Asia. So it happens. But at the same time, the work is so important that I'll tell you the story how I wanted to start doing this book. So I was up in Singapore and we were doing some events up there. And I met these people that were working with a financial intelligence company doing really high-tech analytics on transactions involving Chavez in Venezuela. And they were two masters economists who had left Venezuela. So they're sitting in Singapore trying to find out where the nation's wealth went. You know, it's a massively wealthy country, huge oil reserves. In the 1950s, they said to me, Venezuela was the 4th richest country on earth per capita. And they said, now it's a failed state. And so what they said to me was, and I'll never forget it, they said, so they were trying to find out where the money went. And they did find it. It was a fascinating money laundering story. But they said to me, what you guys in the West need to understand is we were once like you. And it only takes 20 years to destroy a democracy. And they said, we know what it's like. We've felt the battens on our backs and we've sniffed tear gas and we're now out of the country and Venezuela's just in an absolute mess with Chavez. And they said, you guys need to take care of your democracy. And so that was one of those moments where it just was so profound, and I was like, I have to write this story because I don't think Australia is aware of how far down that path we are. If you lose the integrity of your economy, everything goes with it.
So how much of a challenge is financial crime in Australia, and what can we learn about the fascinating cat and mouse game of fintel spooks and crooks? And I love the word terminologies that you use in your book, that you describe in the book.
At the end of the day, Australia has had a commitment internationally to try and fix up money laundering through gatekeeper professions. And it's this insight into our political malaise. How have these laws that we've agreed to internationally, that we're going to get grey listed by the international community in 24, 25 if we haven't done it? And that adds to massive cost. Pakistan had that happen. It cost their economy about $50 billion. Wouldn't the government care that foreigners are coming in and swapping our finest waterfront property for worthless chemicals? You know, precursor drugs for methamphetamine, for instance, that come across the border. We know that we've seen the busts, you know, the drops in the ocean. Vast volumes of illegal drugs coming into Australia, being sold and literally being swapped for property. You know, why are we allowing this? It's mind-boggling. And we've got the laws on the table. 16 years of successive governments, 8 prime ministers, saying we're going to fix this, and they never do. And the reason is, as I spell out in the book, this corrosive force of self-interested lobbying. You know, powerful lobby groups getting the ear of government in Canberra and subverting our democracy.
So really what we're looking at is, what's the question here is, it's quite right, is it true that China is to Australia what Russia is to the City of London?
Yeah.
You know, what risk does we face going forward in terms of the Russian money laundering? I mean, we only go back to the Bank of Cyprus on 4. For those, just a quick clarification, I've got asked, put this forward a little bit earlier, and we might put the elephant in the room to bear pretty quickly. Background, if anybody saw Four Corners, not last Monday, the Monday night before, there's Four Corners ran a
She's going,
program.
I knew he looked familiar, but he was more sunburnt on TV.
So, he was too.
I've been flightboarding all morning.
Then I said, oh, God, everybody's going to ring me up. It's going to be political, da-da-da-da. We don't need to be. Oh, he said, it's fine. We'll be right, Mark, So Other comes up in Four Corners and away we go from there. I thought it was quite funny because I rang him and he said, well, I said, the Lucky Laundry. He said, no, that's the Unlucky Foundry. And I thought it was quite a good coin for it. So, but that is a really, I can't get my head around, having and managing, as we do, a funds management organisation, how an organisation like the Perth Mint couldn't be registered for AUSTRAC, and all these basic things. So maybe while because that may just give us a deep dive back into the money laundering side of it, but without getting hung on it, maybe it could just give you a little bit of experience. And we've got a couple of people in the audience here that can probably talk a little bit about their experience. Crown is one. So let's do that. Let's do that.
So there's a case study, and you've got you've got Perth Mint that no one is in there, actively laundering money. So you could argue that at the cases I talk about in the book, Commonwealth Bank and Westpac, there was a profit motive there, undoubtedly. And I go into that in detail. They all get up and say, oh, there was no profit motive. There was. Even if it's just turning a blind eye, saving on compliance costs and reducing staff headcounts, there's a profit motive. But in Perth Mint, it's incredible. Why would a state government-owned corporation take that risk? Perth Mint went from being this conservative smelting business that supports the gold industry, and it morphed into a global fintech business. But not just a global fintech, a fintech that pins gold in their vaults to a cryptocurrency token that trades on the Ethereum blockchain. And no one was aware of this. And then they realised that actually in setting this complex structure up, they were a remittance business, which made them Australia's largest illegal unregistered remitter, which is that's actually a criminal part of the anti-money laundering law. So hugely serious failures, and you just have to ask how. Well, I would say it's symbolic of the Lucky Laundry in that we're this beautiful, trusting community where we've lived in a world where you didn't really, people were pretty honest and you knew people, and it's a small community. And so we're so trusting, and that trusting nature in the modern economy, where 80% of our criminal threats are coming from offshore, we are sitting ducks. So I've spoken to John Hempton, for instance, who he was the guy that spotted the Trio Astara fraud. I don't know if you remember that, back around 2009. There was an attack on Australian superannuation, and it was like Bernie Madoff. They set up these funds, and they were the highest performing funds year after year. And the guy that was coming second got so annoyed that he looked at what they were doing, and he took one look and goes, oh, look, they're booking profits on their hedges, while they're losing money on the currency. So they were clearly a fraud. And he uncovered that and told ASIC nothing happened, and $176 million of retiree money was lost. And he said to me, superannuation is a honeypot for international criminals. This is just the start, right? So you think about your self-managed superannuation fund, all of the people that had their money in Trio Astara lost it. If you were in a registered fund, you got paid out by APRA. And that bailout happened from a fee on everyone else's account. So everyone that was doing conservative things now has to pay to bail out the people that were in this fraudulent fund. So it comes back to Perth Mint. People here are so trusting. The world has changed. We've got international financial criminals in countries where people are desperate that just see us as something to attack. And Perth Mint shows, the naivety around risk. The idea that you just didn't need to do any of this stuff because no one's going to come in and give you fake ID, are they? No Russian kleptocrats.
No bikey's going to walk in with $27,000 handed over in cash.
He's probably just sold a Harley.
That's it.
I should stress there is no allegation that was. It was more around. Hang on a minute. So what happens is when you get a customer like that, you screen them against your watch list product that I mentioned earlier, and you get a match. And it'll list what that person's linked to, whether it's organised crime, adverse media, politically exposed person. And then you've got to look into them and do enhanced due diligence. So there's a process you've got to follow with those customers. And what it ultimately leads to is you can still take that money, you can still sell that bullion, but you've fed intelligence to Austrac. And then Austrac feeds that out to the WAPOL or the AFP or whoever it is. That's how the whole financial intelligence system works. But what we had at Perth Mint, unfortunately, was an organisation that was so naive about risk that they didn't do any of that.
But hasn't the story been, the money laundering aspect of the story's been buried by the mental doping? And I know, Peter, you wanted me to ask a question. Peter's one of our directors of the board. He's been in my ears. But in terms of, it's still staying within the standards.
Yeah.
So it was a bit, the Four Corners was pushing that side more than really the competence around the money laundering. Would that be a fair?
I think that's the conscious media strategy now, is keep pushing it back to the gold doping. I watched the whole media conference of the Mint and the Premier, and every question, they go away from money laundering and breaching American commodities laws and go back to gold doping because it's just a contractual breach. So no, that wasn't, I don't believe that was Four Corners.
So for those who haven't seen
that.
it, Bank of Cyprus does these Omni accounts. So money goes into Russia, into the Bank of Cyprus. They package it all up so they're on anonymous bank accounts and across to the Mint. Thank you very much.
So imagine you've just sold gold to a bunch of Russian kleptocrats and you're holding that gold in your government-backed, taxpayer-guaranteed mint. It's the only mint in the world that has you all out there liable for its failures. So if that mint gets robbed, if it gets $1 billion Austrac fine, if it comes across the radar of, God forbid, the Office of Foreign Asset Control in America for sanctions breaches in the context of the Russian war, we're all paying for that. That's the reality. So how did this business stray into such risky practices in return for a $40 million a year profit? It's the country's 7th biggest exporter by dollar value, and it's making $40 million a year. So it's an unbelievable scenario. And so if you are in that situation where you're holding gold on behalf of someone who is now sanctioned for their links to Russia, what do? You can't close the account out. If you sell the gold down and send them a cheque, you've just breached US sanctions. So you get stuck with these customers for, who knows how long. So it's very hard to unwind once you find yourself in this mess. The government has set aside $36 million. I've seen other businesses spend hundreds of millions on remediation plus the $1 billion fines.
There's so many interesting characters in the book, like crazy characters. And I suppose I'm intrigued about, okay, it might be for people in the book, you might find it boring because you've read it, but which is the character that's larger than life that you find most interesting out of all the people you've written about?
I think
like saying, who's your favourite child?
No, I've got some favourites. Bill Micah is like the dream. If you're a writer and a Bill Micah comes into your life, you just drop everything and turn on the recorder and keep ordering the beers. So Bill Micah was a Eurobond trader. He's so smooth. I call him the silver fox because he's just like the man. And he was a Eurobond trader, and then he'd always wanted to be a cop. So he kind of applied for the police. He's a Canadian, went to the police and applied, and they immediately took him and sort of diverted him to a different program. So this is what happens to undercovers. They get taken out before they get coppified. You don't want them rocking up wearing Hawaiian shirts, do you? and oversized board shorts. So before they become coppified, they take them into the undercover program. So he ended up becoming this covert operative that went inside Miami's money laundering scene in the 1990s. So there was so much cocaine money washing through Miami. And the American cops, when they seize something in an asset seizure, they're allowed to use it in live ops. So the Ferrari, the Rolex, the Italian suits, they can all put that into a person's character. And so Bill creates these characters. He's like an actor, He's creating a character, but it's worse because you can't do a second take. If he gets found out, he might get murdered. So it's a high stakes acting. And he got given a boat in the Fort Lauderdale Marina, kitted out with cameras and microphones, and they got 120 of Miami's finest on that boat laundering money for his drug cartel and walking out with suitcases full of cash, all on camera. So it was a hugely successful operation. And, Canada's biggest money launderer got caught up in it. There was a whole bunch of stuff that happened. So that's his world, and he's now based in Hong Kong, and his life and his stories are incredible. But in the book, he enters the book because he's down in Australia, on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, trying to trace down assets that have been the result of frauds in China. They've got this huge problem with people defrauding investors in China, coming down to Australia, spending all the money, setting themselves up and never going home. And so we don't realise it, but this is happening on the streets of Australia. And you've got Chinese spies running around trying to find these people. You've got people like Bill, who's a bounty hunter, in effect. He's a civil asset recovery agent, and he finds the people, and if he can get the money back, he gets to clip the ticket. Wow. So this is happening on the streets of the Lucky Laundry, 100%. Think about $2 trillion every year sloshing around the global economy, and 5-10% of that coming in profits for anyone that can wash it, clean it, obfuscate it, get it usable, separate it from the predicate crime. You are talking about vast amounts of money. And then, of course, that money gets reinvested in making more money. So you've got this pool of dark capital that sort of roams around the globe, picking off assets and undermining democracies.
Do you reckon this whole the central bank digital currencies, will that, if they all happen, I mean, I feel like we already use a non-paper currency, we're all online using our cash anyway, but these new central CBDCs, currencies, will that clean it a lot? Will that help? I mean, in effect, is that what they're trying to do by bringing them in?
We probably almost need an entire night on that topic, but in effect, the reason I'm concerned about CBDCs is because with all of this stuff, you have to find a balance between the public interest and people's privacy, right? And in the West, we strike this balance. So, if you want to get access to someone's financial data, it's a big deal, and there's processes that go with that, and you've got an assumed right to a level of privacy. So once you move to a central bank digital currency, it's basically another way of describing it is programmable money. And so what that means is your government can timestamp it. If they want to do a stimulus package, they can say, here's some money in your government-issued wallet, you've got 2 weeks to spend it. They can tell you that you can only spend it on groceries and healthy things and not fast food. This is what programmable money allows. And so once we move into that world, in effect, you all have a current account with the central bank. So you don't need commercial banks to intermediate and create credit. You're just getting money straight from the central bank and you've got a wallet. So every dollar that you spend is visible. And I think we need to ask, what's the price of, we're always trying to strike a balance, right? You want to have a clean economy, but you still want to hang on to some civil rights.
Yeah. So I suppose in relation to a family that's got significant capital, high net worth, or whatever people want to call them, what do you see for them? I mean, obviously I see reputational risk if they get caught in some money laundering thing, but what do you see as the main risks for us as individuals in Australia and in Western Australia protecting our wealth?
So if I give you the example of cyber attacks, we are, in Russia, for instance, there are cyber criminals that get permission to operate within Russian territory on the basis that they don't attack Russians. And so they have impunity sitting there running cyber attacks out of Russia. But the catch is if the FSB needs them for something, they're on call. So you can see there, this is the kind of world we're in. So now that the world's turning into this multipolar situation, which was inconceivable 5 years ago, we're getting this big schism that's tearing down the middle of the financial system. We're now seeing America using sanctions, which is really tools of economic warfare, and they're weaponising the US dollar's status as reserve currency. You've got to be so careful when you do that, because if you push too hard, you're going to break the system in two and there's going to be a breakaway. And we're seeing that happen now. Russia's got its own gold-backed currency now
Yeah.
that operates outside of SWIFT. So, we're kind of moving into...
Well, there's a different settlement, isn't there? Yeah, instead of SWIFT, they've got their own.
They've got their own. It's called the SPFS. That's their own, and they back the currency. They were talking about Perth Mint. They were pooling gold. China's been pooling gold, and when America sanctioned them, guess what they did? Backed the ruble with gold. It doubled in price.
Wow.
Right. So these huge events are playing out. I think this is something that families need to be aware of. And factor in. So we're now in a kind of a multipolar world where things are changing so fast. And the other thing that you need to factor in is the regulators are not going to be there to save you. I hate to say it, but don't rely on ASIC to keep your money safe. Don't rely on APRA. It's up to you, to do that, because in the work we do at Thomson Reuters, we just see too many tragic stories, like the Sterling First investors here. And then the other bit would just be that, just be aware that scams and things like that are on the rise. And like the cyber example, some of those people that are perpetrating those scams are getting given safe harbour in some hostile states that think it's great that the West is being undermined. Really interesting from a financial intelligence perspective. Bitcoin everyone believed it was anonymous. So Silk Road was this drug marketplace where everyone was using Bitcoin, and we knew that it was completely surveillable. And so I was telling people back then, check out this Bitcoin. And then 6 years later, they turn around and say to you, why didn't you tell me to buy Bitcoin?
Yeah, no.
Whereas if it tanked, they'll remind you that you told them.
Okay, so you don't want to tell us.
No,
Okay,
no. But what I would just say is that, I probably would just say that it's an environment where the risk and the reputational risk is something that wasn't considered 10 years ago is now really important, particularly for high net wealth families, like some of the presentations we've done before, where it's not just what you invest in. You're seeing now this activist investing and ESG is everywhere, and it's like, people are being outed because their super fund is in coal or oil or something like that. It's a really surreal environment. So I think that's probably just what I would say from my perspective is bear in mind the reputational risk aspects of investments.
Where we end up, Nathan, because we want to open it up to the floor, but the book's quite fascinating where it takes you through a journey of, mules running around and putting 99,990 into an ATM. Is that right? No, 9,990. Under 10, had to stay under 10,000.
Oh, no. Commonwealth Bank wasn't doing any monitoring.
So it wasn't?
No, the Commonwealth Bank wasn't looking, so they could put in whatever they want and there was no reports going.
Combank must have known that, so because these were all running all around Sydney and everywhere like
$600,000 per machine before it jammed. And, you'd meet a guy on the corner, he'd have a backpack, he's just done a drug deal, he's got $1 million in a backpack. You meet him, you swap a note with a serial number on it that you've got on your phone that the handler who's overseas has given you, and you make sure you swap the note and then you walk away with the backpack, and then you pop down to the CBA and shovel 600 grand into the IDM machine, the intelligent deposit machine, and then go to another one, put in another 400, that's your day's work. So you can imagine how many people in Southeast Asia were willing to have a free holiday in Australia and do an hour's work every morning and earn $300-400 a day, which was unthinkable money. So there was like an army of people that was just relentless, and that's why the AFP had to. If you look at the Austrac claim, I say it in the book, if you look at the Austrac claim, the hidden hand behind it is the AFP, because all of those AFP cases kind of formed the substance of Austrac's 680-page statement of claim against CBA. So you can see there the criminal intelligence community were working together to say this has to stop. This is wholesale money laundering. $5.1 billion moved through those machines, and they will never know how much of that was criminal money. Look, I always try to take it back. When I'm talking about dirty money, I bring it back to the reality of the predicate crime. So, if you're in money laundering, in my view, you're driving the getaway car for the loot at the scene of the crime. So I believe you're complicit. If you're actively engaging in money laundering, it's not white-collar crime. You're facilitating and enabling crime because apart from crimes of passion, it's all profit-motivated, acquisitive crime. And so criminal groups, for instance, in the drug trade, care a lot more about losing their money than their product. And the book opens with a guy that got shot 5 times in the face because he had a bag seized with $1.5 million in it at Crown Casino. Right? So this is happening on the streets of Australia. So you've got to go back to the underlying predicate crime that it enables. The case of Westpac, it was child exploitation. So they were trying to be clever, running, these huge, basically enabling multinational tax evasion and giving major corporates with bank accounts in Singapore an Australian BSB number. So you would pay into their Australian BSB and the money would go straight to Standard Chartered, say, in Singapore, and the Australian Tax Office can never find it, right? Westpac kept no records. So multinational tax evasion's going on, but it's hard for the government to sell that when it's going out and fining this major bank that every West Australian owns in their superannuation. So when they found out that in turning a blind eye to that aspect of money laundering, they were also moving heaps of money for child predators in the Philippines, that was kind of what brought them down, in effect. The horror of that was something that Australians just couldn't tolerate. So, let's look at Perth Mint. It's just gold, right? Who cares? It's just some ID. It doesn't really matter. It's just inanimate lumps of metal. Well, I know from my sourcing that up in Papua New Guinea, to talk about the human rights aspect, up in Papua New Guinea, there's, big Barrick gold mine, Porgera. And then on the side of that, there's all these dirt poor people who are up there mining outside, alluvial gold outside the actual mine. And it's a big problem because it's bad for Barrick to have that going on. And then there's all this illegal gold that's generated. What do you do with illegal gold? It sells under market value. So West Aussies are jumping on planes, flying up to PNG, buying this gold, right, cheap on the market, getting it fashioned into some jewellery, necklaces, because you don't declare that coming in, do you? They say, are you carrying bullion? Flying in on commercial flights, rocking up at the Mint and saying, I'm here to smelt some more jewellery, right? And the Mint's no questions asked. So Perth Mint, state government, taxpayers and all of us are morally culpable for the murders, the rapes, the violence, the environmental destruction, the mercury poisoning that's going on adjacent to that mine. So that's why money laundering matters.
Wow.
Well, we're going to pay, right, because the price that we're going to pay for the lucky laundry is that our kids are never going to be able to afford to leave home. Yeah. So that's going to suck. They'll still be living with us when they're 30. So we're going to pay penance somehow. I guess, to bounce off that, the thing that is a bit concerning is I know, I'm sure we can all relate to having amazing grandparents and parents, hopefully. And my grandparents were horrified by corruption. My parents couldn't tolerate it. They'd sit there and rail at the news, when someone was dodgy or dipped their hand in the till. And that was the Australian culture. I think there was an absolute, hatred of corruption. We just thought it was contemptible. And then I've noticed, we're falling down the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. People now see stuff and they just go, oh, Canberra, Yeah, so in a way, this complacency that you talk about, I think it's real, and it's really concerning that if we let it get to that point, that's where the failed states that I've visited in my work, the really...
The Venezuelans. Oh.
Yeah, or just parts in our region, where countries in our region where, people just feel like corruption's, like Malaysia's a good example, with 1MDB and Najib. It was everywhere, It was the top of the pile and people just lived with that and accepted it. And they are the brave. I've trained some of the anti-corruption people up there and they're so brave and they're amazing and they love their country and they're, people were getting murdered by the government over 1MDB. So they were fighting for their country, and then you look at Australia and you go, gee, do we realise what we have to protect? Oh no, I think in public messaging there's a role.
Yeah.
To make people aware of where we're at as a country. I think that has a value. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, we can't let that complacency take root and just say that this is the inevitable way of things, because we have so much to protect. Yeah. I've just come back from Sri Lanka, where we were doing some work with their financial intelligence unit. The country's in ruins, right? So during COVID, they looted the country. The finances were mismanaged. And basically, you saw the footage, right, where they stormed the presidential palace because there was queues. Basically, they defaulted on their debt, and there were queues for 5 days to get petrol. People were dying in queues for petrol while that was going on. And the inflation's at 50% because the currency's collapsed. So the whole place is in a state of abject turmoil. And they took their eyes off the ball when these tragedies happened. So like the Venezuelan example, we are so naive if we think that couldn't happen in Australia.
Yeah.
We are not different, we're just luckier.
But we're not hearing enough about it.
I think our democracy is like a community garden, and everyone has to jump in from time to time and pull a few weeds, and chip in and believe in the commons, because what we're suffering is like that great essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, where self-interest kicks in and then the community garden or the shared plot of land goes to pot. So, if people start realising that they've got to be part of the solution and that living in a functional democracy does have some obligations where you've got to chip in a bit and give a bit. The great character in my book, Paul Jevtovic, who was an immigrant whose father at 14 fled communism in Serbia as it was sweeping through. And he was 14 and he walked to Austria with a bunch of men, queued up in a line and couldn't even speak English. And they said, Australia. And he's on a boat to Australia. And his son ended up being this amazing AFP guy. And he was the person at Austrac that put his foot down and said, I don't stand for this.
That's fascinating.
It took the courage of this man to galvanise that agency and say, no, enough's enough. The banks have been running amok for 10 years. We've got to stop this. And they did. So, there's a story of someone that kind of came here and appreciated how special Australia is. And he said to me in one of my interviews with him, Nathan, we've got to stop taking from this country. People just take and take and take. We've got to give back. And he's totally sincere, and he spends his life giving back. So there's that. But also, just more fundamentally, we've got to get these anti-money laundering laws passed for real estate agents, lawyers and accountants and jewellers and other areas.
Is that happening now? Right?
Well, they're the laws that have been kicked down the road for 16 years, but Mark Dreyfus now is in charge of it, and he's a really amazing person, very good operator, very astute politician. So I've been told that they're going to do it this term, or at least start moving on it. So that would be pretty cool. But the challenge is, our property market has become so highly leveraged that Canberra is petrified of, the game of Jenga and pulling that thing out. So that's sort of what has held them back from doing this. It's nonsense because it's not going to happen, but that's the Pollyanna, scare story that vested interests and lobbyists have told them for 16 years. So it's going to be tough for Labor to do that at a time when the economy is kind of uncertain. But let's be honest, there's never a good time to pass difficult legislation. And when a moment comes up, in your working life where you need to show courage, and it happens in all people's lives. Like, there's someone in my book at CBA who's sending off emails saying, I'm seeing these guys sitting on milk crates with fake ID, washing money, please do something. Or Paul Jevtovic, or, many of the others. The lawyer that ran the cases, Sonia Marsic, is a phenomenon, she's a weapon. She took down two of the biggest, most powerful companies in Australia with this tiny legal team at the Australian government solicitor, So there's all these things in life where you called on to make
It's called arms, really, isn't it?
Even something smaller than that, just an act of integrity or something like that. I think that to me is what is an Australian, because the previous generation and the one before, when we were all growing up, I just used to look at them as heroes. They seem to have so much integrity, and I feel like we need to hang on to that.
Is this book the first time we've heard the truth about what truly happened at Bankwest during the GFC collapse?
That was a little Easter egg that's in the book for the West Aussie audience. I don't think I'll be getting the Premier's Book Award this year, but
Not after Four Corners.
not after Monday, no. But there is a Western Australian thing in there, right, around Bank West and the collapse of Bank West. Right. So did you notice that after the collapse of Bank West, WA had a recession for 12 years, didn't it? Right? A lot of property projects were falling over and people were getting loans and then getting denied finance because all the lending decisions had gone back to the East Coast. So this was the closure of Bank West and the absorption into CBA was a disaster for WA economically. You know, when the GFC hit and HBOS collapsed, Bank West was their second worst bank outside of Ireland. So when it was adjusted for currency, 27% of their loan book was bad. Right, so it was a basket case. Now remember when APRA and the regulators were saying, oh, we didn't get a GFC in Australia because we just did things better. No, you had one of the worst banks in the world that had just been run to the ground by HBOS and you let it happen. So what happened there, and it's in the book, is, you know, even the Hayne Royal Commission, I don't believe, exposed what really happened. Bank West was such a basket case. If that news had come out, it would have been the first domino in the Australian financial crisis. So a decision was made at the top tier of government in the Council of Financial Regulators. This could never get out. So CBA was brought in to swallow up Bank West and bring it inside. And then when they did that, the condition was they wouldn't know what they were buying, and it wasn't going to be allowed to bring down the mothership, of course. And they've got this thing, you know, under prudential regulation, they use the advanced approach under Basel III, which means they can set their own capital, kind of, and hold wafer-thin capital. So if the bank got infected by Bank West, their whole capital ratio would have gone up. So there was a deal behind the scenes that ASIC wouldn't move in for conduct regulation, the ACCC would wave it through, and APRA would stand back and let them restructure the bank. Now, what should have happened is a bad bank should have been created, and that should have been really bailed out, because what happened in reality was they were allowed to purge the loan book. And when they bought the business, they discovered that HBOS had no idea where its loans were. They had something like 70% linked to commercial property, and so they just had to purge that from the book. So all of those people, like the Brendan that I talk about in the book, got forced into bankruptcy as a result of that. And so really, Bank West customers took it in the neck to save the financial system and to save the reputation of the regulators. It was an abhorrent piece of Australian history, and it's kind of a story that was never told. Could I just make one comment? Yes. So the closing chapter of the book is this triumphant, jubilant travel moment. And I closed on that because I think it's so important. We're dealing with some dark topics, you know, and some human nature issues and all of that. But you've got to stay optimistic. You know, that's the Aussie way. So I do end on this high note in the book at the end. And I think that's all of these conversations should, because, you know, we still live in one of the greatest countries in the world. And the fact that you're all here wanting to talk about this shows how much you love Australia and want to live in a good country and want to leave a good country for your kids. So the battle is far from lost in Australia.
I want to thank everybody for coming. For those that don't know about Private Invest, as Elizabeth opened up, we're a non-bank lender. We're located over here at Cottesloe and in Double Bay in Sydney. We don't need to be the biggest in town. We just need to be the best. And the more that you talk about these things, having run a major ASX listed company, which was the largest in its sector, the bigger you get, the less you can touch things and see things, and the more things slip through their leakages. So just reinforced to me tonight, wow, I think we're on the money. Stay where we are, build an optimism model, keep a small team. We've never had any write-downs, no impairments. The returns are above the average risk-weighted return in the sector. Stay with the money from there. So, but I just found this subject, I can't, but just talking to Nathan just fascinates me, because it's just a world. What you live in is quite incredible. So I do encourage you to read the book. It will be signed. And I really do want to thank, I'm going to give you Mate, so seeing you still surfing, we had to get you a gift. Right? And I had to hide it under here so you wouldn't see it, so I'm going to now try and find it. It's still here.
Block of wax.
So, no, that's not wax. So we thought we'd give you a champagne. Given we go down to Yellingup, we can share that sometime
mate.
with you.
Yeah.
But given you last time you're on Four Corners, you had the sun cream. So we thought we'd mix it up with the 50 plus and the Mo show. So put a hand together for Nathan and for Elizabeth. Thank you very much.